Good morning. I hope you're enjoying this unique UBC course on COVID-19 and society. I'd like to thank Professor Lyon for inviting me to talk about COVID-19 and the environment. I've been spending a lot of time on that, as you know. Although this course focuses on COVID-19, the pandemic is not the only crisis the world is facing. Even before the first cases of COVID-19 were reported late last year, we were already grappling with the serious issue of climate change and environmental degradation, and that continues today, as you can see, with the wildfires. In fact, just about the same time that health officials were investigating reports of a mysterious new SARS-like illness in December of 2019, UBC was declaring a climate emergency. In the declaration, we noted that the climate crisis is posing and will continue to pose extensive and disastrous threats to people's lives and livelihoods both locally and globally, contributing to famine, migration, and disease worldwide, including impacts on individual, physical, and mental well-being. I'll discuss what universities can do in the climate crisis later, but first I'd like to go over the scope of the climate crisis and then discuss how, despite being a global issue, climate change adversely affects some groups and regions more than others. After a short discussion break, we'll get to the heart of today's topic, COVID-19 and the environment. Finally, we'll talk about the opportunity that COVID-19 presents for repairing the damage to the environment, and then get into the specifics of how universities and their students can help in this effort. So let's begin. Even as we're dealing with COVID, the world continues to experience extreme climate events. We had a good example of this just a few weeks ago here in BC, when the sun disappeared for a whole week because of wildfires in Oregon, California, and Washington. For a couple of days, Vancouver actually had the worst air quality of any major city in the world. Wildfires are, of course, common events, but their effect and impact have been multiplied by climate change. As Steve Easterbrook, director of the University of Toronto School of Environment, said, "We know there is a very clear link between climate change and wildfires because hotter, drier conditions allow fires to spread more widely." Professor Easterbrook warns that things will only get worse. In his own words, in a decade or two, we might look back on this summer as a relatively mild one in comparison. But even if we somehow stop burning fossil fuels altogether, things wouldn't improve. As Professor Easterbrook says, when we stop burning fossil fuels altogether, whatever temperature the planet has reached at that point will become the new normal. The smoke from the fires was a visible sign of the current environmental crisis, but not the only one by any means. Here are some of the most recent findings of the United Nations Global Environment Outlook. Since 1880, the global average surface temperature has increased between 0.8 degrees and 1.2 degrees Celsius. 8 of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred within the past decade. Air pollution now causes between 6 and 7 million premature deaths every year. It's projected to continue to have significant negative effects on health and still cause between 4.5 million and 7 million premature deaths annually by mid-century. It's staggering. Biodiversity loss from land use change, habitat fragmentation, overexploitation, and illegal wildlife trade invasive species, pollution and climate change is driving a mass extinction of species, including critical ecosystem service providers, such as pollinators. Marine plastic litter, including microplastics, occurs at all levels of the marine ecosystem. It also appears in fisheries and shellfish at alarming levels and frequency. Land degradation is an increasing threat for human well-being and ecosystems, especially for those in rural areas who are most dependent on land for their productivity and livelihoods. Almost a third of land globally, home to 3.2 billion people, has been degraded. About 1.4 million people die annually from preventable diseases, such as diarrhea and intestinal parasites, which are associated with pathogen-polluted drinking water and inadequate sanitation. The harmful impact of inappropriate use of pesticides, heavy metals, plastics, and other substances is of significant concern, as such compounds appear in alarmingly high levels in our food supply. They primarily affect vulnerable members of society, such as infants, who are exposed to elevated levels of chemicals. The United Nations report makes for pretty grim reading. We're all suffering from the effects of environmental degradation, but unfortunately, some are affected more than others. And the ones who are most affected tend to be members of marginalized and disadvantaged communities around the world. And yes, here in British Columbia. For example, hazardous waste from Western nations is often dumped without the knowledge or consent of the local inhabitants in countries such as Ghana and other developing countries. There, the toxins are dispersed in the air or leach into the groundwater. Communities of color in the United States, Indigenous communities here in Canada and in BC, and low-income communities everywhere are also at disproportionate risk from commercial toxic waste. Resource extraction, for example, mining for the rare earth metals that are used in smartphones, causes environmental degradation in Africa, South America, and Asia, to the benefit of consumers in North America and Europe. There's also a gender disparity. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature reports that human trafficking rises in areas where the natural environment is under stress. It's found links between gender-based violence and environmental crimes, such as wildlife poaching and illegal resource extraction. Indigenous peoples and local communities manage more than half of the world's land. Strengthening the land and resource rights of indigenous peoples would help combat climate change and environmental destruction. However, environmental degradation from deforestation and loss of biodiversity, pollution, contamination of rivers and water sources, and extractive industries have all had a cumulative negative impact on indigenous communities. The Amazon basin provides the most obvious example of this, but it occurs here in Canada and all around the world as well. So as you can see, even before the onset of COVID-19, our world was in crisis. Before we continue and discuss the current situation, let's pause and discuss what we've learned thus far. Well, I hope you've had a good discussion. about the environmental crisis and its impact. In this second part of the course, we'll discuss COVID-19 and the environment, both how environmental factors have played a role in the pandemic and how the pandemic has impacted the environment. There's evidence that the same human activities that are contributing to climate change are also contributing to the emergence of new diseases, such as COVID-19, and also to their spread and their effect. According to Daniel Brooks, author of The Stockholm Paradigm, Climate Change and Emerging Disease, we live in a world in which human population expansion and increased density and increased globalization of travel and trade act synergistically with climate change to produce an explosive emerging disease crisis that represents an existential threat to technological humanity. Brooks believes that the planet is a minefield of pathogens with the potential to infect susceptible hosts, needing only the opportunity for contact. Climate change has always been the major catalyst for such opportunities because it disrupts the local ecosystem structure and allows pathogens and hosts to move, according to Brooks. Once pathogens infect new hosts, novel variants may emerge, each with new infection capacities. Now that's the theory, and there's evidence to support it. According to Michael Petroni and his colleagues in the journal Environmental Research Letters, exposure to hazardous air pollutants contributes to COVID-19 mortality in the United States. Petroni found that an increase in the Respiratory Hazard Index, which measures air pollutants, is associated with a 9% increase in COVID-19 mortality. In a recent literature review in the journal Science and the Total Environment, notes several studies that show a significant correlation between climate indicators such as temperature, humidity, wind speed, rainfall, and COVID-19 transmissions and fatality. Okay, so climate change, pollution, and other environmental changes have probably contributed to COVID-19 and exacerbated its effects. What about COVID-19's effect on the environment? Well, at first it seemed as if COVID-19 would actually have a positive effect on the environment. The natural world began to recover from human influence in the first few weeks after the pandemic was declared, as whole countries went into lockdown. People, at least those who were able to, stayed home. There were fewer cars on the streets, fewer planes in the air, and industrial production decreased. Noise pollution also decreased. Videos of wild animals roaming the streets of deserted cities went viral. Travel in the United States dropped 96% in April, the TSA estimates. Car trips also plummeted, according to P.M. Forster and his co-authors in the journal Nature Climate Change. Global greenhouse gas emissions fell 10 to 30% in April, mostly due to reduced driving. Some environmentalists called this the anthropause. However, as countries emerged from lockdown, GHG emissions began to rise again, and the wild animals retreated from the city streets. In China, which locked down earlier and started up earlier than other countries, air pollution levels are already at their pre-COVID levels. And even though vehicular and air traffic, as well as industrial activity, reduced sharply in most parts of the world, this was not the case with electricity. 64% of the global electricity energy mix comes from fossil fuels. According to the World Energy Outlook 2019, and electricity use actually increased during COVID. It was probably air conditioning, all of those Zoom meetings, Netflix binges, and DoorDash orders using up a lot of electricity. COVID-19 is having some decidedly negative effects on the environment. Deforestation in the Amazon basin and poaching in Africa increased during the pandemic. Closer to home, recycling initiatives such as restricting the use of plastic bags and single-use beverage containers were canceled to help stop the spread of COVID-19. The increase in takeout orders and online deliveries has added immensely to the amount of cardboard we produce, use, and discard. To sum up, there is evidence that environmental factors have contributed to the spread and severity of COVID-19. As for COVID-19's effect on the environment, there was a short positive effect, but overall, the effect has been negative. Let's break now for discussion and then return with the final part of today's session, where we'll discuss the post-COVID-19 environment. Welcome back to the final part of our discussion, where we'll talk about the post-COVID future. We'll talk about the opportunity that COVID-19 presents for repairing the damage to the environment, and then get into the specifics of what universities like UBC are doing to help this effort. Some commentators have speculated that greenhouse gas levels will decrease because more people will be working from home rather than driving to work. However, this is unlikely for a number of reasons. It mainly applies to white-collar office workers in the so-called developed nations. Some workers who do have to commute to the office will switch from public transit to private automobiles because of the fear of exposure to COVID-19. Fewer trips will be offset by longer trips, as those who can will move further away from city centers. In the long term, the temporary shifts in behavior caused by COVID-19 won't change our current warming trajectory. However, there is hope. As governments around the world work on their economic recovery plans, there is an opportunity to enact climate-friendly policies, such as investing in low-carbon technologies, which could avert the worst warming. That could help reach a goal of cutting total global greenhouse gas emissions by 52% by 2050, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels through 2050, according to some researchers. Even big business is recognizing the potential. Almost 200 CEOs from around the world have signed on to the Science-Based Targets initiative, calling on to reimagine a better future grounded in bold climate action and to base their COVID recovery plans on divesting from fossil fuels and innovating in low-carbon, resilient solutions. The opportunity is there, and we can help. Universities can lend their expertise in the environment, in economics, and in other disciplines to influence these recovery plans. University students such as yourselves can put pressure on politicians and decision makers to take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I think UBC is well placed to help. We have a mandate and an obligation to advance a sustainable and just society across British Columbia, Canada, and the entire world. We have unparalleled expertise in sustainability, economics, and other relevant fields. And we have students, faculty, and staff who are passionate about creating a better future. It's up to us to seize the opportunity to work towards healing the planet. Thank you very much for being part of this course.